Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our panel on Dads on Duty, a Father's Role in Shaping Society. My name is Brenda Hefera. I'm the Assistant Director and Senior Policy Analyst at the Simon Center for American Studies, which is the American founding division within Heritage. Among the initiatives of the Simon Center is the First Principles Essay Series, which, as the name suggests, are essays that are less focused on policy than on those principles that should animate our policies. And I'd like to turn your attention to the cards on your tables that have a QR code to that series. You will find two of our panelists have written essays for us. It's really a terrific collection. But on to today's event. As we all know, positive role models are incredibly important, and perhaps most especially today for our young men and boys. To that end, we have three speakers with us who embody what it means to be good citizens, gentlemen, and fathers. First up, we have Dr. Matt Meehan, who is the Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale College, just across the street. Among his accomplishments, Dr. Meehan is the author of the best-selling Mr. Meehan's Mildly Amusing Mythical Mammals, which is a beautifully illustrated children's book that takes seriously the formation of a good moral imagination. As is fitting, Dr. Meehan will be discussing the higher purpose of children. Next, we have Delano Squires, a research fellow at the Richard and Helen DeVos Center here at Heritage, who will be focusing his remarks on the role of fathers in society. Delano is a frequent contributor to The Blaze, often writing about the importance of the tie between fatherhood and marriage. And finally, we have Dr. Brad Wilcox, who is a professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. He will be positioning marriage as the keystone institution. Brad is a foremost expert on this topic, and I highly commend to you his most recent book, Get Married. And with that, please join me in welcoming our panelists today. I'm going to start with you. There's been a lot of talk in recent years about declining birth rates in the West. Most of that conversation has been focused on the economic implications that will have. So things like Social Security and those sorts of things. That's not what your paper is on.
No.
Your paper is on the higher purpose of children. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was a concern of mine watching the discussion of the birth dearth. The paper I wrote takes a look at the founding and takes as a touchstone or a jumping off point the founding fathers' letters about their children, both their births and their deaths. And it winds up being a beautiful exploration of the higher purpose of children. You could summarize the entire higher purpose of children in the Declaration of Independence, the famous phrase, the pursuit of happiness. Life, birth, liberty, learning to grow into virtuous citizenship, and the pursuit of happiness, a limited sense of government and a transcendent sense of society and a path towards the stars, right? Life, living, and death, and an afterlife. But it turns out that when you look at the founding fathers and their view on children, it winds up centering our entire democratic republic way of life, limited government, liberty and law. And so that's what the paper is about. To put some flesh on those bones, I look at, for instance, the death of Patsy Custis, Washington weeping and writing a letter about her death at 17 years old and how painful that was. But you see it's an adoptive love, right? That is his stepdaughter. that's not even from his own genetic pool, right? That there is this power of adoption in love, that you can take one's own from not your own loins, so to speak. And that image actually winds up being important because children are not just a private good for the family, they actually do become adopted by everyone else. For instance, if you wind up having a child, that becomes your daughter or son, but it also becomes a nephew or a niece. It becomes a granddaughter or a grandson. It becomes a cousin, and it becomes a neighbor. And it even becomes a fellow or the catcher on your kid's team, and it extends further and further out. And in one sense, that's basic, but in another sense, it gets forgotten when you sort of panic about, well, there's not enough babies to fill the coffers of Social Security. It's like, in one sense, you're aiming far too low. This is actually the entire complex of relationships that we love. Cicero, the great defender of republicanism, says that actually, right, rational animals, rational mammals, that is, we humans, have a much more powerful and endearing love for our young than any other. So it's not just animal instinct. There's something in reason that sees something transcendent in a child and something especially lovable. And that intensifying love winds up spreading out by this adoptive force into society. And so much so that it's also understood as what the Romans called, in the Republican tradition, which our founding fathers and basically everybody before 1950 had memorized. None of this would have been new to your ancestors and predecessors in Republican government, and hopefully it won't be new to you from now on. But they called this entire relation of democratic republicanism the complexa caritatis, the complex of charities. That is to say, the interwoven network of loves, right, which inspire gratitude, which then inspire duty and self-sacrifice. That is to say, nobody ever picked up trash, right, in the local park without having a series of loves that fostered a gratitude, that fostered an attitude towards duty. That's it. And you can say, well, I know some godless blue-haired guy who picks up at the park who's like, yeah, where did he get that habit? And is that habit going to last for much longer? The habit actually comes from children. And the phenomenological experience that we have from having them and from having our friends have them, and then we begin to adopt and serve and love that engine. So much so that, in one sense, that whole habit winds up being what all of our laws concretize around, right? Good law actually is about good relationships. And if it's a bad relationship, it's actually bad law, right? And so foundationally and fundamentally, right, our entire system of liberty under law is keyed towards this, right? Which, we can say a couple more things about it, and Brenda, I'll ask you to rein me in with pronounced coughs. The idea of children also winds up being a kind of balance of liberty and law. Liberty in a democracy, or rather a democratic republic, can slip into hedonism and libertinism. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that with Delano in a minute. But one of the experiences that we have as a people is dealing with children. Children who cannot govern themselves. They just are like a Labrador at the dog park, right? They're just going to go to whatever the senses agitate them to do, right? Reason has to come online and be trained, right? That requires a lot of discipline. It requires a lot of laws. I mean, I've helped here at Heritage with sort of child first tech policy. The idea that kids can just go on the internet without any other guide rails, right? But that experience of, oh, liberty requires law and governance, right? But also the rules require the child to freely choose these things. The experience of raising children, educating children, is a kind of lesson in trying to hit the mark of liberty and law, right? And the last thing I'll say, at least for initial remarks on this, is not only does it teach you about liberty and law, and not only does it teach you gratitude and civic duty, right? It's also because this is such a consolation, because children and the love that's fostered in family is such a powerful good that when present, even if it's not yours, right? I have a single sister who may be watching. I have a single sister. She comes over to my house and watches my Down syndrome daughter, and it's one of the most joyful things she gets to do every week, and she tells me so. I'm not reading in, right? It's not just the family per se, it's actually the entire community gets to participate in those relationships of love and the rearing of the next generation, such that it winds up checking any sort of totalitarian dreams of a system where we're gonna build this empire or get this perfect thing or head out and create whatever the tyrannical dreams of a controlling state. There is this incredible check that says, whatever you have on offer is absolutely secondary to what I have on offer, right, in this family, right? And I actually go through the letters of the most ambitious men. I specifically chose Alexander Hamilton, who's the Mr. Fiery, like, get office, get power, get a strong economy, get an American, sort of Navy, all of that. He's like, you know what? All of this striving, it doesn't come nearly to the level of consolation and excellence of just being home with my wife and child, right? So just that and the presence of that and the experience of children, these higher purposes actually show us, it opens politics into a limited mode, because politics, while everywhere around us and complete in a way, Aristotle's not wrong, it opens up to the transcendent through the experience of the love of the child, while also energizing the duties to serve the political and social. So I do think we're aiming far too low in our discussion of children and family, and we need to use the founding fathers and the principles of Republican self-government and, frankly, human nature to raise our sights so we can win.
Thank you, Matt. That's terrific. Delano, you have written a lot about the importance of fathers. What is it you think we're missing in our culture on how we talk about fathers and how we portray them?
I think one of the biggest things that we're missing, and one of the mistakes we make in discussing this issue oftentimes, is to separate the role of father from the role of husband. And I know Brad's going to talk more about the connection between the two, so I'll just speak on it briefly. But let me start by quoting C.S. Lewis, and this is a quote that, I studied engineering, so I know, limited C.S. Lewis, but this is a quote all of you, will be familiar with. He says, "In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful." Now, this quote has an important application to this topic, because there's no way to remove the institution of marriage and not have that have consequences for the vocation of fatherhood, right? So oftentimes, it's easy to spot this when the political left does it. I remember in the wake of the Dobbs decision in 2022, a lot of the rhetoric around abortion and what the pro-life movement will look like on the left, you would hear, a hospital room is not big enough for a woman, her doctor, and the federal government. And I started to see conservative writers talking about a new pro-life movement in a similar way, where they spoke about the mother, the child, at times the government, and somehow the father would sort of be left out of this entire scenario. And I thought it was a mistake then, and I think it's a mistake now. We've seen this play out again among progressives, where their sense is that a father is nice to have in the home, but not necessary as long as there is a robust enough sort of welfare state and enough social programs to accommodate for his loss. But I think we should not see fathers as the appendix of the family, but in some respects as the backbone or the beating heart. right? So there's a difference in terms of that function. But particularly for anyone paying attention to this in this particular moment, I would argue that this is a bipartisan problem. And I'll give you two names who I believe represent two different archetypes of ways we should not, ideas that we should not pursue as it relates to fatherhood. I'll go easy first. One is Elon Musk, right? So at last count, and I have a Musk baby counter, at last count, I think I saw 14 children by at least 4 different women, right? Okay. Sure, he got the be fruitful and multiply part right, but there's a difference between pronatalism and being pro-family and being pro-marriage, right? So I don't subscribe to the notion that even a billionaire can just write a check and account for the loss in the various households that he's having to support, right? So that's one sort of archetype, the pronatalist who's not also pro-marriage and pro-family. The other archetype, and this one is far darker, is Andrew Tate. Right? So some of you familiar with this name, professional, retired kickboxer, terminally online person who was charged with sex trafficking in Romania, is now back in the United States, and is making his rounds in terms of the conservative circles, right? So his Tate's is lauded because the left hates him, right? He can talk all day long about the poison of feminism, but his version of fatherhood I don't think is healthy either. It's just, I have a bunch of babies with a bunch of women. I don't see any of them, right? I give them a little bit of time every once in a while when I visit, but he's anti-family, anti-marriage, and he's influential because he's a person that many young men, I believe, look up to, right? He's very rich, he gets all the girls, he has a nice car. Neither of those are models that we should adopt as conservative on our side. So I think we need something to aim higher, to piggyback on Matt's point. We need to aim higher and we need to reconnect the institution of marriage with the vocation of fatherhood.
Okay, thank you. Brad, you wrote a paper for us on marriage as the keystone institution. Why is marriage the keystone institution?
Well, as I kind of respond to your question, why don't I just kind of also register the vibe shift point, right? And actually back in July, the economist Tyler Cohen kind of detected a vibe shift that was kind of rolling out across our country, Brenda. And he proceeded in that kind of posting in his kind of, way, 19 ways in which the nation was kind of moving to the right. And in his sort of number 6 for that kind of, I think prophetic post in the vibe shift, he talked about the ways in which the falling fortunes of men across America had pushed, quote, more and more men, including Black and Latino men, into the Republican camp. I think this kind of vibe shift, again, that Cohen was talking about back then is deeply connected to the issues that we're talking about today here up on this panel. And many scholars, including my friend Richard Reeves, have been chronicling the ways in which boys and men across America are faltering in our country today. Too many of our boys are failing in school. 2/3 of the kind of bottom performers in our schools today are boys. Too many of our young men, I can see on my campus at UVA are not there. Almost 60% of women in college, almost 60% of college students today are female. Too many men are failing at work. About 1 in 4 non-college educated prime men are not working today full time. And then I think partly as a consequence of all these kinds of things we're talking about, too many men are dying deaths of despair because they have no distinctive mission to live for, no one to love, no one to be there for as both husbands and fathers. And so seeing hundreds of thousands of men in recent years dying deaths of despair. Mm-hmm. But until I think maybe now, to some extent, it's been very difficult for our friends and fellow citizens outside of these kinds of more conservative circles to tell the truth about the way in which kind of the breakdown of marriage and family life are a major contributor to the kinds of trends we've been kind of chronicling, including Reeves has been chronicling for our boys and men. In my own research, my own work, I've been kind of pointing out how boys are less likely, for instance, to thrive in school
and in college and in the workplace and then life more generally when they don't have a married father in the home. And in fact, in my recent book, In Get Married, what I find in terms of like the most striking finding for kids is that today in America, young men who are growing up without a married father in the home are more likely to spend time in prison or in jail than they are to graduate from college. So again, for whether they're single mother households, step families, even adoptive households, again, young men who are growing up without their married dad in the house are more likely to land in jail or in prison than they are to graduate from college. And by contrast, young men who are growing up with their own parents in the household are about 4 times more likely to graduate from college than they are to spend any time in prison or jail. So it gives you a sense of how a lot of these issues we're concerned about today really intersect with today's topic and how important marriage is for our boys. But of course, marriage is also consequential for men, and fatherhood is consequential for men in the context of married fatherhood. We see, for instance, in a recent Harvard study that the income premium for married guys is largest for married men who are living with their own biological children. So again, kind of we're seeing sociologically that married fatherhood is really important, not just for our boys, but also for our men. And then looking at this issue of deaths of despair, which is kind of the opposite of the pursuit of happiness that Matt was just touching on. Jonathan Rothwell at Brookings recently discovered that, quote, the marriage rate measures are each more important in looking at deaths of despair than college attainment, age composition, or race in predicting, again, deaths of despair. So we kind of can see how on a number of key outcomes, both for boys and for men, kind of the health of marriage is incredibly important for both boys and men. And so it kind of brings back to the vibe shift. I think what we're seeing is, again, not just kind of on the right, that more and more people are kind of identifying the importance of marriage for boys and men in terms of understanding what's happening to our boys and men. But even someone like Richard Reeves, who has in his previous work, in his book, of Boys and Men, he discounted the importance of marriage as a solution to the kinds of things challenges that we're talking about today. But just last week, I think even Richard's sort of been kind of caught up in this vibe shift to a certain extent. Because what he wrote just a few days ago is this. He said, without the positive pressures that come from being a father and husband, men are even less likely to really go for it on the work front. They're more likely to be unemployed. They're more vulnerable to addiction. They're more socially isolated, all of which makes them less attractive as potential spouses. Boys raised in single mother households then struggle in school and in life, and they have difficulty finding a mate and forming a family too. And so the cycle turns. The economic struggles of boys and men become entrenched across generations. So again, what I'm saying to you today is that even one of our most thoughtful voices on these issues on the left, I think is coming to recognize and even articulate in public that any effort to tackle the falling fortunes of boys and men across this country must run through marriage and family. And then this makes sense if you look across time and space, because I mentioned in my paper for Heritage, the great Harvard anthropologist Joseph Heinrich has recently observed that, quote, marriage represents the keystone institution for most, though not all, societies, and maybe the most primeval of human institutions. And what he's getting at is that in most civilizations, the institution of marriage plays a pivotal role in organizing family life, promoting human flourishing, and maintaining social order. And it does so in part by stabilizing men and women's sexual relationships, thereby binding men to their kids, and endowing the lives of men with a much deeper sense of meaning, direction, and solidarity. So it's in these ways, I would argue, that if we want to get more dads on duty for our boys, for our men, and for our nation, we must keep pushing at efforts to renew this keystone institution.
Brad. Okay, Matt. To what extent is the declining birth rate causing the breakdown of civil society?
In the paper, it's brief, but I sort of allude to a wider body of scholarship on dystopian literature. The Children of Men, P.D. James, The Children of Men, has sort of a poet thinking fictively about what does it mean if there are no children. And basically what happens is all civic life stops because everyone says, well, I don't care anymore. Like, what does it matter? We're adults, we're sort of habituated, we'll be fine, we can survive. And civic life ends, and everything falls into basically strange dictatorial conglomerations. I do think that that is a temptation, that you lose democratic, Republican self-government, and you lose the sort of civilizational confidence to say no to a nanny state, a totalitarian overlord, a red or blue Caesar, or whatever it is, right? If you don't have a robust social life with lots of kids and families and strong bonds, the way Brad's talking about the marital bond. Those are institutions of great solace and great joy, and they're actually the reservoir that people can say, no, I can now live or do or work or serve. And the alternative is to basically, I'm too tired, I'm too sad, and I'm too weak, so why don't we let someone else take care of this? And that's on the sort of despair side of it. And then the other side of it is, I don't have anyone to take care of me. I don't have a family. I don't have a strong network. And so, right, I need, just on a practical level, I need a larger government. On the civilizational level, I think putting dads on duty, you think of Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Locke. Everybody talks about the father's role in basically looking at the next generation, looking at the world out there, and saying, okay, we need to train you up and discipline you in this way for this world, right? And that kind of back and forth discourse, with the absence of that habit, I think that's another sort of aspect of this civilizational decay. And to focus it on fathers, the way Delano and Brad are doing in particular, and implicitly in my paper, I think is exactly right, because I'll go all the way back to Plato's Republic. How do you lose a civilization? How do you lose a way of life? How do you lose the American experiment in democratic republicanism? Well, you ask the political philosophers, and if they're being casual and lazy, they'll say, well, it's the cycle of regimes, right? One regime decays into another, decays down into tyranny, right? And so you lose the one regime, then you get democracy, then you get tyranny because of the chaos. Well, it's interesting. In the Republic, there's a number of cycles of regimes, but the only way they devolve, Plato says, Socrates says in the Republic, is inattentive fathers. Like, that's it. Like, that's the sole means by which regimes decay, is dad's not on duty, to use Brad's line, right? And as a result, he doesn't actually teach them about the world and about their nation. And this is, I've been a teacher of boys for many years before I went into university teaching at a boys' prep school here in Potomac, Maryland, the Heights School. But I was always like, what's something I could do to help my son be more duty-bound? It's like, go show them the historical markers in your neighborhood, especially around here. Like, look at your forefathers. Call attention to the sacrifices of others. Because if you talk about you, like, well, son, I've sacrificed for you. That's backfiring quickly, right? Especially when they hit 14. But the general habit, right, of look at who sacrificed and suffered for you, right? Introduce them to this world of this complex of charities, of sacrifice and love. And that gives them a sense of awe and a sense of binding unity with their political community, such that they will serve and they will seek justice and they will seek peace. And I think not having those rhythms is causing societal collapse and decay in a pretty profound way.
Delano, has there been a shift in our aspirations? So do young men still aspire to become fathers and are not realizing that ambition? Or do they no longer desire to be fathers at all?
That's a good question. I think I've reached the age where when you ask me about young men, I'm thinking, well, some of these guys are young enough to be my sons, so I'm not sure if I'm the best spokesperson at this point, but certainly I feel confident that the young men in this room still do aspire to those traditional roles of becoming a husband and a father, right? I feel confident. The young men in broader society, I'm sure many do, but again, the voices telling them that marriage and fatherhood and family are a bad deal are becoming louder and louder. And if you're, again, familiar with the horseshoe theory of politics, someone like a Tate or a Rollo Tomasi or a lot of the guys who are sort of on the red pill circuit are really not, they're a stone's throw away from your garden variety, gender studies professor at the local college, right? They're both telling their respective crowds that marriage and family are a bad deal. They're both telling them that if you get married and then get divorced, somebody's gonna take half your stuff. They're both telling them that the other side has all the power in society and you'd be foolish to give up on your life's ambitions to sacrifice for a spouse and children. And I think those messages are getting through, honestly, to some people. I think that's one of the reasons that people are getting married less and later. The median age of first marriage in 1980 was about 24 for a man, about 22 for a woman. Today it's about 31 and 29. I see no reason why. I hope those numbers begin to come back down, because I don't think you need to wait to get married until you have 4 degrees, you've made partner twice over, you own 2 houses and a condo and a timeshare, and then you say, now I'm ready, to have a family. Works slightly better for men than for women. I wouldn't advise it for either. But my hope is that that desire is there, because that's a natural and a good desire. My concern is that the voices that they're hearing from sometimes both sides of the aisle, from men and women alike, and then adding in their personal experiences, right? So for years, social conservatives wrote about the breakdown of the family, particularly in the inner city, and you're talking about kids who didn't grow up with dads because their parents were never married, but then you have children who have seen their parents go through divorce, and sometimes very bitter divorces. And that personal experience can sour someone on the institution of marriage and the vocation of fatherhood. But that's why I believe we need new voices who can affirm the good, the true, and the beautiful, who can paint a different image of fatherhood, one that is not perfect, right? I pray when my kids get older, I have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. I pray that when they get older, they will be able to appreciate me despite my imperfections as a father. But what I also pray is that my sons see me as a model to follow, right? So sons, follow me as I follow Christ. And then my daughters see me as someone to say, I want a man who treats me the way my dad treats my mom. That to me is the mark of a successful life.
Thank you. So Brad, Delano talked about some of these voices in the manosphere, Andrew Tate, Pearl Davis, who are telling young men that they shouldn't get married. Deal for men.
Yeah, no, it's just striking that, I spent probably, 15, 20 years kind of arguing with liberal feminists about, the benefits of marriage for women. And now I'm having the same argument with people like Andrew Tate and Pearl Davis, including online. And, again, what they're saying is that marriage is a bad deal for guys. Pearl Davis says it's a, quote, death sentence for men. She uses that term. And Andrew Tate says that there is 0 statistical advantage when it comes to marriage for guys today. And part of their kind of way of looking at this issue is to assume that most marriages today end in divorce. And what they're either unaware of, or I've actually engaged with Pearl on this issue online, or unwilling to acknowledge, is that actually today, for all of our problems, and there are obviously many problems in America on this whole issue, but for all of our problems, most marriages, Brenda, today go the distance. And we've seen the divorce rate actually come down 40% for married Americans since 1980. and it looks like it's going to keep going down. That's partly just because marriage is more selective today. It's more selective for both, more affluent, more educated, but also more religious and more conservative Americans. And those groups, as I point out in my book, Get Married, are less likely to end up in marital trouble oftentimes, and they're generally more happily married as well. So what I think, again, Pearl and Tate are missing is just that, yeah, there's a lot we can complain about, but marriage is more stable today than it was back in the 70s and early 80s. We've learned some lessons, and there are also some things you kind of can do to reduce the risk of divorce if you're a guy. And so what I find in my own research is that, for instance, men who are stably employed are much less likely to get divorced. And I mention that in part too because a bunch of the folks that I know who are now divorced are friends who were actually not kind of always making like the most effort to kind of be reliable, breadwinners for their wives. And I could tell this was kind of a corrosive, dynamic in their marriage. It kind of created a sense of financial insecurity on the part of their wives that I think was part and parcel of why they ended up divorced. So that's one thing I would say that we can kind of tell men. Another thing we can tell men is that folks who are attending church together as a couple are markedly less likely to get divorced. I mean, I find 30% less likely in my own work. Tyler Vanderbilt at Harvard finds almost 50% less likely to get divorced. So there's some big effect we see in different data sets there it's worth mentioning. I also find in my work that regular date nights are associated with less divorce. So kind of encouraging guys to be intentional about continuing to cultivate intimacy, communion, romance in their marriages across the life course. You don't want to end up in a gray divorce, once the kids kind of fly the nest either, right? So the point simply is that there are things we can kind of, I think, tell our young men and our married, husbands to encourage them and, and give them some advice about how to both, form a good marriage and deepen their marriage in ways that protect them from some of the dynamics that people like Tate and Davis are kind of focusing on, and they're kind of not giving us a kind of an appropriate and truthful roadmap for how to get married and stay married successfully in America today that we need to give to our young men and to the guys who are currently married as well.
Thank you. That was terrific. Do you want to respond?
I just wanted to add something about the sort of Tate bro. I think you've already said it, but I want to put an exclamation point in. It's unmanly. It's not manly. And I know there is a crisis of manliness. That's real. And I think we have to have the confidence to basically say that fatherhood is the arche. It's the archetype of manliness, right? That's what being truly manly is. And part of that is meekness, right? The meek shall inherit the earth is the summary of the stats that Brad's talking about. But meekness is not sheep. Meekness is holding masculine anger and strength in the palm of your hand so that it is utterly controlled for the execution of justice and not for flaming out online and savaging things ignorantly without doing your homework.
Yeah.
So like that kind of confidence needs to be restored because people do want manliness online. These young people want manliness, and they have to be, the farce that is online performative manliness has to be zeroed out with some serious counter manliness. So forgive me for opening the aperture of meekness just a little to flame that, but it's nonsense, right? Yeah. And we need some controlled bursts to absolutely nuke that out of existence.
And if I can say something, I think what we are seeing in the Tates and the Pearl Davises and some of these other voices is an overcorrection, because for decades, the message that many men have been getting is that, masculinity is toxic. We need to sand down and smooth out some of the rough edges of men. So a lot of guys have gotten soft, physically soft. People will talk about the dips in testosterone, but part of being a man, and one of the reasons I appreciate my dad and the men I grew up around when I was growing up in New York, is that they taught us to do hard things. They weren't constantly coddling us. Now, when you have both parents in the home, you can have balance, right? Dad is hard on the son runs to the mom comforts the son, and you have that cycle. And on the flip side, Mom might be hard on the girl runs to the dad, seeks comfort, so, oh, I know, baby, it's okay. And you have some balance. But when you have generations of young men being raised primarily by women, it throws off the balance in the household. And sometimes what's even worse is that mothers feel that they have to compensate and say, okay, I see how men act. Let me try to enact that so I can raise my son to be, a real man. And it throws it off. My wife has even told me sometimes, I prefer you to administer particular types of discipline to the boys because I don't feel that they receive it from me in the same way. And I think part of that is because it's not a performance. I'm speaking their language, even at 5 and 6 years old. I'm speaking their language in a way that they can understand it. So part of what personally I see as my role as a dad is to teach my sons to hold up, to endure difficult things. So when they fall, when my son dives for a ball in basketball, the first 2 words you will hear coming out of the stand is, get up. Get up. Now, unless his head is, on, okay, we can get some medical treatment. But I'm trying to instill in him something, to be resolute, to be determined, because in this society, there are always going to be people that tell him, no, emote. Tell me, you need to cry more. You need to be more emotional. And then you do. And then she's like, oh, he's way too emotional. So we need to get back, and this is why fathers are so important, and this is why it's a cycle that's continuing, because without fathers there's no one to teach the boys this. So they continue down the wrong path, and then they become angry men who sire children and then abandon them, and then the path, continues. And I feel like we need to sort of break that and get back to embracing who we are as embodied human beings, as men and women, not just parent 1 and parent 2.
And I'm the kind of, we've been kind of knocking some figures on the red pill right, obviously, today. And that's needed, and it's important, it's valuable. So thank you for doing that in your own ways, guys. But we also, I think, have to understand and appreciate that, in the main, people like Andrew Tate or Elon Musk are really exceptions. When you look at kind of the broader American family landscape, what you see is not that conservatives obviously are perfect, because we're not. We all know that. But that we are doing comparatively better when it comes to marriage. Conservatives are more likely to be married. They're more likely to be happily married. We see also when it comes to kind of raising kids in a stable married family, that kids are more likely to be raised in a stable married family in conservative circles. And then also, it's interesting, again, to turn to Richard Reeves, is he did a little piece for Brookings a while back, kind of looking at how liberals and conservatives are assessing kind of the state of men in our society. And then how they're kind of assessing the state of their own boys. And there's a fascinating kind of pattern that he found, and that was that basically conservatives were more worried about the state of boys and men in the society at large compared to liberals. Liberals were less worried about kind of the state of men and boys in our society as a whole. But then when it came to their own boys, fascinating kind of flip. Liberals were more worried about kind of the state of their own boys, and conservatives were less worried about the state of their own boys. So I think it kind of just tells us how, again, like, we can look at Andrew Tate, we can look at Elon Musk and realize that they are not models for us to kind of, lift up when it comes to family life and marriage and fatherhood for obvious reasons. But kind of in more ordinary precincts out there in American life, what we are seeing is that, conservatives, I think, are more likely to understand and appreciate the power and value of marriage, of fatherhood, and to kind of also have a better handle on the sort of value of a kind of pro-social masculinity, which Delana was just touching on in his comments.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So we do have some time for questions. We have mic runners in the room, so please wait for them to come to you. And I would ask that you ask a question and not pose a comment. And if you want someone specifically to answer that question, indicate that. Otherwise, we'll let these gentlemen determine that. Yes, sir.
I wonder if, thank you. Yeah, I wonder if the problems that were brought up today sort of fall outside of the scope of what policy reforms can accomplish, and whether or not these problems will be solved by reforming policies in order to reform culture, or sort of the other way around, reforming culture in order to reform some of the policies that brought up these problems? Thank you.
So I mean, I think
Feel free.
Yeah, I think in answering this question, it's important just to acknowledge that you know, we need to do both, kind of reform the policies and kind of reform the culture. And there are obviously, you know, civic and religious and, you know, like media-driven strategies to address some of the cultural challenges here. But I think on the policy front more specifically, I think we have to recognize both that kind of the law is a teacher, you know, to sort of paraphrase, say, Thomas Aquinas, and to recognize too that the state obviously has a huge role, you know, in our culture today, you know, both at the federal, the state, and the local levels. So I think from a policy perspective, more concretely, what I would say is that we could imagine, you know, that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services could get behind a PSA campaign on marriage and fatherhood that would be helpful, for instance, in much the same way it's done on issues like, you know, drunk driving, for instance, or teenage pregnancy. We could imagine that, you know, we could eliminate marriage penalties in our means-tested programs like Medicaid, for instance, in ways that would make marriage a better deal financially for working-class families across this country. We could imagine that we could take, you know, measures in state and local governments to bridge that gender gap in our schools, where, you know, so many boys are floundering in our schools today. And there are things we could do to make, you know, our public schools more boy-friendly and to bridge that gap, which would have implications for our you know, our topic today. So I mean, there is, I think, a place for us to be thinking about ways that public policy levers can be pulled to strengthen our boys and young men and to make marriage a more attractive and accessible institution. One final point there, just what do you think is the U.S. department that employs in the federal government the most people? Anyone want to guess here? Which? He just said it, defense. Yeah. So the DoD, right, is our biggest, you know, division in the federal government in terms of employment. And, you know, a lot of people, actually including Richard Rees, I don't mean to pick on him today, but, you know, I've been skeptical that the federal government, for instance, can do anything to strengthen marriage in America. And yet when we look at rates of marriage, what we see is that, you know, men who are employed by the DoD, you know, in the Army and the Marines, the Navy, Air Force, are way more likely to be married than their comparable civilian peers. And there's a much smaller gap, for instance, by race in, you know, the U.S. military than there is in the broader civilian population. We'll see that working class guys who don't have college degrees in the military, are way more likely to be married than their civilian peers, you know, who are you know, not holding a college degree. So, and that's in part, I think, because in the U.S. military, all the benefits are geared towards married, you know, families. So if you're cohabiting, your cohabiting partner doesn't get any special benefits. If you're dating someone, they don't get any special benefits in the military. But if you're married to that person, then they get, you know, health care, and you both get a much better housing, you know, setup or allowance in the military than you would get if you were dating or cohabitating. So I think we do have evidence from the military that when the state does kind of, you know, preference or prefer or, you know, treat married folks in a more advantageous way, it looks like, you know, it does have an effect on behavior. So I think it's an example worth kind of meditating on as we think about policy going forward.
Yeah.
I'm almost embarrassed because I know Brad's been in this particular fight for a very long time. So I won't get too into the weeds, but I would just say, don't underestimate the power of a conversation that underpins a policy proposal, that if you enrich it, clarify it, purify it, and strengthen it, you can actually move the needle even without the policy much changing at first. And I would just point you, look what the left tried to do on sex, the trans movement, right? The conversation that sort of is the foundational mud in which you put a pylon of policy into holds if the conversation is good, but it slides and sinks if it doesn't. So this is pre-policy in some sense, but if we get these things right, old policies that are moribund and being abused can just be, with the wave of a pen or just a memo or an email, fixed, right? And new policies can be brought forward the way Brad's talking about. And special pleading, not a federal issue per se, although I'm sure there's probably some zone in each little nook and cranny of our monstrous administrative state where this could be employed. But we switched to no-fault divorce. And the law is a teacher, and you don't necessarily need to whip people into getting married because that's the wrong play. But why not have everybody call it both your faults divorce? Honestly, right? If marriage is this incredible good that is in the hands of two people who freely make it work or fail to make it work, right? Then if you want to get out without it being someone's fault, you have to assume both. It doesn't change custody battles. It wouldn't change a single thing, but you just reverse the moral polarity of the law by having the law be described in a new way. And that would be, on the moral level, a new law that would be driving in the right direction as opposed to the wrong, where, oh, whatever, it's just this thing that fell apart like a tricycle I misassembled at Christmas. It's like, no, this is a tragedy of the highest order with the greatest things at stake for time and timeless happiness. So why don't we talk about it differently, both at the level of pre-policy conversation, but then a nice, easy handoff into, this is how this law will discuss marriage going forward in the state of California. I think it has an impact.
Yeah, I would just, agree totally with what Brad and Matt said. I mean, people say, the Breitbart doctrine is politics is downstream from culture. I would argue culture is downstream from religion. So a big part of, I think, what we've touched on today is that religious institutions play a big part as it relates to marriage and family formation. So I know it almost sounds, blasphemous being in a public policy think tank to lean more in the direction of culture. But if I was king for a day, I would take culture before I take policy.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm asking my question from the perspective of somebody who's been married to the same woman for 54 years. And here in the Washington, D.C. area, no less, and raised my kids here also, and I got 4 grandkids. Okay. Basically, I like what I'm hearing off there, and this question is addressed to anybody who would dare answer it. In terms of the, and during that time, using some millennial Gen Z language, I evolved from being a beta male to an alpha male, and now probably, for lack of a better term, a sigma male.
Sigma.
I would be the lone wolf, or I don't know, American family exceptionalism, whatever. Okay. In terms of public policy, in my opinion, having lived here since 1955, yeah, I'm that old, but is probably restoration at a federal level of marriage is only between one man and one woman. Like, look at the thing that Viktor Orban and over there in Hungary, his policy, like that. Now, so what would you all think in your perspective? Do you sort of why or why not would be ingrained in the Constitution of the United States at a federal level that marriage be defined as only between one man and one woman? Why or why not?
You want to
So
go?
I'll yeah, I dare. So I'll leave the constitutional issue to Matt. I think it was a mistake, obviously, to try to read for the government to try to redefine what a marriage is. But this didn't start in 2015 with Obergefell, right? I think Brad mentioned no-fault divorce. So we've seen a devolution in terms of the definition of marriage, right? What once was a lifelong covenant between one man and one woman, you have no-fault divorce, so that removes the lifetime requirement. And then you have Obergefell, and then the misnamed Respect for Marriage Act, which says no longer a man and a woman, just 2 consenting adults. To the left, I would say, well then, what moral, ethical, political reason do you have to keep your definition in place in perpetuity? Let me put it a different way. Why only 2 adults? Why not 3? Why not 5? So at some point, they're going to have to answer that question. I would love to see a return to marriage being defined as between one man and one woman. I don't think that's the reason why, we're in the situation we're in terms of marriage and family. Obviously, redefinition is a big problem, but we were starting to see cracks in the foundation a long, long time before 2015. So one of the attributes of being a good man is taking responsibility. So I'm not going to blame, the LGBTQIA2S plus community for why marriages and families are the way that they are right now. So to answer your question, yes, I would like to see that redefinition, but on the constitutional matter, I'll leave it to the Hillsdale professor.
So I'll answer with what Shakespeare called a jade's trick. I'll let you look up what a jade is. It's not flattering. Put it this way, that is an enormously high bar, right? A constitutional amendment. And that requires an enormous amount of consensus, which requires an enormous percentage of the population of the United States to agree with that principle. We are so far back in the stocks on this one.
We don't have the cards.
We are back in the blocks on this one. We are not, so part of me says, like, as a kind of art of the deal, sort of Sigma Trumpian move to play it as like, yes, we're gonna go for that when you're never gonna get that anytime soon. I mean, go for it. But as a strategy, I would just say this to this crowd, which is a more statesmanly DC crowd, generally speaking, that doesn't want to get out over their skis quite that far. You, as a Sigma, can, but many might be less or more reticent to do so. Everybody wants to play Lincoln. The abolitionist movement over here, and then the slavers over here, and I'm going to navigate the middle and bring peace and justice and slowly win this issue. But I submit to you that if Lincoln looked around and found no abolitionist movement, the Lincolnian thing to do would be to start it, right? And I think that's, in a certain sense, where we still are, is at the very beginnings. I've actually looked into the beginnings of Roe v. Wade and how the absolute hilarious cowboys, even before the Roe v. Wade decision, everybody, the real wise saw it the writing on the wall beforehand. They started journals, they were making arguments about the ethics, right? The politics, the history, the common law. Like, we are so far back on the marriage issue, but I think it's actually a statesmanly job to create the movement at this point. And many are trying, but I do think there's a tendency to hope for something to happen where you have this post-Lincolnian moment, but we're not even in a Lincolnian moment. We're not even in a Garrison moment or a Frederick Douglass moment. Like, we need to build the movement in large part. So.
Okay, we have time for one more question. This gentleman up front.
First of all, thank you guys so much. This has been really enlightening. I just got married back in December. I don't know how much applause that's worth, but thank you. Yes, we are. I'm actually here because she, quote unquote, suggested I attend this. So no, but my question today is specifically getting back to the relationship between, I think, civic buy-in and having children, but I think much more than that, and this is directed towards you, Dr. Meehan, not just having children, but maybe a relationship to children in general. And I think what I mean, and what my question is, maybe what your take is on the discourse around something like the J.D. Vance cat lady thing, where articulating should people have a bigger seat at the table if they have children because they have more investment in the future of the country, but if that's maybe missing the picture that it's not just having children but in what you kind of were saying, the network of nieces and nephews and cousins, that it's multiple families. And I'll try to make this point because I think I'm going on. But I'm going to make a mortal sin in referencing Harry Potter rather than Lord of the Rings in conservative circles, but that we might become Malfoys, the kind of like single child urban elitists, as opposed to the Weasleys, where it's kind of more the rural family values. I'm going on and on. I don't know if that makes any sense. What I'm getting at.
I'm not sure the Potter reference is tracking with the previous part.
Sure. Yeah.
But I'll try and answer. Or you?
Yes, I will say I'm a former student of Dr. Meehan, so any kind of ramblings or misstep I lay at his feet
I
as
did
an
teach him
improper
literature,
teacher.
so
Yeah.
the mishandling of Tolkien is
yeah.
an upsetting. Thank you for the question, and thank your wife for getting you here. I think that the discourse about whether or not you participate equally under law as a citizen is a misguided one. But I do think it's real, and it's just ineluctably so. It's just the case that the more virtuous and self-sacrificial you are to the common good of the country, the more participatory you are in your status as citizen. So if it's a cat lady with no kids who is serving well and doing a lot of virtuous deeds, so be it. She likes cats, right? But I don't think that's what JD meant. I think he meant selfish, right, versus self-sacrificing. And insofar as family and having children and being married and laying your life down for your spouse and your children, right, as a father in this topic, but as a mother too, that is a kind of, as I joke, it's almost like an engine of virtue, because your choices are become a horrible human being or become a better human being, right? It's like much worse. Like, I have to change this diaper or I'm an abusive and horrible father, right? I've got to continue to sacrifice. You have to kind of level up, right? That's not on offer for single people as easily. But I do think it's good to remember that insofar as the cat lady thing is a nice stand-in for someone who just takes care of their cats and doesn't give a darn about anyone else, then sure, fine. But it's not about the cats. It's about how sacrificial you are for others. And I know lots of single people who have laid down their lives for everyone else around them. And I think that's a proud part of the Christian tradition. Everything from apostolic celibacy to the Catholic priesthood, right, to people going on mission and delaying marriage for 3 years or 2 years. Like, those are all real things. So it's good to just sort of get your definitions down.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you all very much for this robust and important conversation. Please join me.
Yeah, that's great.